How many of you like bridges? How many of you like going over bridges? And I know some people in this room that do not like going over bridges. I won't let on who, but sometimes people get scared over bridges. I've crossed some amazing bridges. I don't know, has anyone ever crossed the Coronado Bay Bridge? The Coronado Bay Bridge, very high, a couple hundred feet high minimum, I'm sure.
That's scary.
Yeah, kind of scary. Of course, I've crossed the Golden Gate. I've also been on the flagship bridge of Florida, and that's the Sunshine Skyway Bridge. Anyone been over that? All right, beautiful place. But so some people hate crossing bridges. I understand why. But why do men make bridges? Simple answer. Sounds like a joke, right? Get to the other side, right? Men make bridges to get to the other side of something, or from one place to another quicker. Now, we might not think much about the construction of a bridge, but a lot goes into a bridge. I saw a video one time where this bridge started, I don't know if you've seen this video, where the bridge started moving, and before you know it, it kept moving until it just came apart. A lot goes into a bridge. There's inherent dangers. You know, there's dangers in transporting people hundreds of feet over a canyon or over an expanse of water. There's inherent dangers in that. Designs need to be put in to account for winds. Remember the twisting of a bridge. Strength needs to be built into a bridge. It needs to have a firm foundation. I'm amazed if you look at maybe the construction of the Golden Gate Bridge to tunnel or make a pillar down into the ocean, into the water, and then be able to handle massive weights, to carry trucks and cars. You ever been on a bridge in a traffic jam? That's kind of scary sometimes when you feel the bridge moving and there's like 70 tractor trailers on the bridge with you, full. Do you ever stop and think, Lord, I hope this bridge... when I go over the Coronado Bay Bridge, again, it kind of goes like this around, and I don't know how tall it is. I'm analytical, and now I'm going to try to figure out how tall that is, but it's probably a couple hundred feet high. And you don't even think about it. You just go flying over this bridge, but boy, I would not want to have a part of that bridge fall when I'm on that bridge. But you know that there's a lot that goes into a bridge. Bridge builders know the dangers, but watch this. They know the great opportunities bridges give to us, and they can do it safely and successfully. Bridges are a great thing. When they build them, watch this, they use providence. They use providence. Because they know the business and ability of bridges, they can foresee the issues and prepare for them and build something that can safely and effectively transport millions and millions from one place to another. Long before man knew anything about bridges, God was, and He is today, the reigning expert in providence. In providence. The word providence, someone help me with that. What does that mean? We talked about it a little bit last week. What is providence? Rule, right? Specifically in this situation, the word providence means foresight. It's to see before. Remember, the word comes from the word provideo, to see before. So providence means foresight, to see before. It also means timely care or active foresight, seeing ahead the wants and making provision to supply them. That's providence. So if you think about a bridge, a man and a score of men and construction people, they build a bridge. Providently, they know what is needed to get people across. They've done this before. They understand the need for proper construction, for earthquakes, for weight, for twisting. They have providence in the sense they already know this. They know beforehand what they have to do to build into the bridge. So the word providence means to make provision and then to supply the provision. I want you to know God is our ultimate provider. That's where we get the name Jehovah Jireh, the Lord, our provider. Can someone think of a Bible example where this word was used? Jehovah Jireh. Genesis.
With Hagar.
Mm-hmm. I think, well, the one I'm specifically, Hagar too. Hagar, we get the name El Roy, the God who sees. So God saw her situation. It's a good example. God saw ahead and He provided for her and made a great nation of her son. Okay, but Jehovah Jireh is Genesis 22, when God told Abraham to take his only son, Isaac, and take him up to Mount Moriah. By the way, that's the same place that the temple will be on again one day. But Abraham went to that place, and Isaac said, my father, we have the fire, we have the wood, where's the offering? And he said, my God will provide himself a lamb. That's where we get Jehovah Jireh. Can you imagine how thankful Abraham was when he did not have to follow through with what God apparently told him? And in the ram, there was in the thicket, there was a ram caught. And there we get the name Jehovah Jireh, God, the Lord, our provider. So God is our ultimate provider. When I think of this word providence, I immediately think of George Washington. George Washington, his favorite name for God was Providence. And you know what drives me crazy? I said this to you a few years ago, but there's a man that wrote a book, and I love American type, present history type books where they look back. And one of the gentlemen, his name is Brad Meltzer, and he writes some good stories about Washington and other political things from days gone by. But what I find that they say about George Washington was that he was a deist, and they said he rarely used the name of Jesus Christ. I got I was reading his book, and he said he was not very religious. And you know what? I have scores of scores of comments where he says, I'm trusting in the blood of the Lord Jesus Christ. And they said he was a deist and didn't believe in Jesus. So I wrote to him, and he answered, and I said, I respect your book, I got a lot out of it, but you got this history wrong. And he responded nicely, but I don't know if it fazed him. But this is what happens. We have a retelling of history. Okay, I've even heard the story that George Washington was baptized by a Baptist pastor. So either way, the point is, providence was a way that George Washington recognized God. In the story of Esther, the providence of God is the shining light throughout this book. If you want to find one thing, one word to describe this book, it's providence. The providence of God is shining. Providence is a way to describe his overruling care of his people. As we looked last week, we found that the first chapter, and this chapter too, there's an oblivion to God. The leaders and the people in chapters 1 and 2 are operating in the complete absence of God. But in the complete absence of God, God is behind the scenes working. We're going to see that. So the providence of God is his overruling care of his people. And this divine guiding hand, I want you to know this, the divine guiding hand of God continually meets up with the free will of man. And that presents no difficulty for God. Okay? God is big enough to extend to mankind the freedom of will, yet is still able to perform his will. Some say that if man makes a decision against God, then God has lost control. I don't know what planet they are on, because people are doing things against God constantly. And the only option that you have, if God loses control when man does something against him, if God loses control, we have a pretty small God. And that's not the case. So, we will see, and we have seen in the story, a lot of decisions that man made that God had nothing to do with. We talked about that this morning. One commentator I know says that we should not be involved in politics, that it's too late. I disagree with that. But I do agree that the only hope for America is in the gospel of Jesus Christ. It's not in the White House. All right, but we have a responsibility to our government. But our Speaker of our House said it was God's will that Joe Biden became president. Now, that we can believe that in the sense, because we talked about this in Sunday school, Psalm 75, and then the book of Daniel, chapter 4 and verse 17, says that God puts up one and puts down another. But to throw a little monkey wrench into that, in Hosea, chapter 8 and verse 4, God said to Israel, he goes, you've set up kings that I didn't tell you to set up. Now, I'm wording it a little bit different. How do you reconcile that? And Heather read to me something on social media that when maybe something difficult happens in your life and somebody says, well, there's a reason for it, God had a reason for it, that's not always the case. Satan might have had a reason for it, and God allowed it into your life. We have to be very careful when we talk about providence, God allows certain things, but there's also a free will. And sometimes God uses the free will of man, in fact all the time, he uses the free will of man to accomplish his purposes. So as we go into this book, Just because something happens doesn't mean God ordained it. But God has the ability, as a sovereign God and as a provident God, to work all things out to his plan. All right? We know this to be true. Ephesians chapter 1 and verse 11 says, He worketh all things after the counsel of his own will. But be careful not to attribute something wicked to God. Okay? So God is greater than some men's puny idea of him. He can be perfectly holy and righteous, not violating man's freedom of choice, yet he can bring all things to a good and right conclusion that all men will give God the glory for. There is going to be a day, we talked about it last week, but there's going to be a day when we stand there, or we're on our face there, in the sea of humanity, and every knee is going to bow, and every tongue is going to confess that Jesus Christ is Lord to the glory of God the Father. Sadly, many of those people will end up perishing, but there will be a cacophony of voices, every human that's ever lived, and we're going to hear it ring out, God, you're right, or God, we're going to give Jesus Christ the glory. So last week, time we were here, we commenced chapter 1, seeing a people that were oblivious to God. There was a distinct absence of God in the lives of the leaders and the people spoken of in Shushan the palace. We saw that there was a royal party. There was a royal problem, which gave way to a royal plan, and that's where we're going to pick up in chapter 2. Today we begin chapter 2 with the thought, Providence prepared 2. Providence prepared 2. There was 2 people that God was preparing in his providence to make a difference. So Providence prepared 2, that's our title. Our God knew that evil was about to take root, and it was about to spring up to trouble his people, so much so that this danger would put his people in imminent peril, both young and old, little children and women, and he was not about to let that come to pass. Now, in spite of what this world imagines, I tell you this from my heart, this is not a dusty old book. This book that I hold in my hand is not a dusty, old, boring book. If you will just sit back and read this story and see the intrigue, the deceit, the trickery, the power of God to overcome for his people, you won't say that. If you sit back and let this story unfold, you will never say those words that it's a boring book. I hope that never comes out of your mouth. There are situations in this book where you might think this is a little bit less exciting. But you know what? God puts doctrine in this book. It puts truth. He puts his love towards us. But you know what? Thank God he puts stories. I don't know if you like a story. I love a good story, and this is definitely one of those. But if you know the love of Christ, which passeth knowledge, Ephesians chapter 3 and verse 19. If you have the peace of God, which passeth all understanding, Philippians 4 and verse 6, you will never utter that this book is a boring book. You know what you'll utter? I've got to spend time in this book. I've got to open its pages. I've got to figure out who this God is. I've got to know the power of his suffering. I want my life to be made known so that I can conform to his suffering, that I may know the power of Christ and that may his power rest upon me. I hope you'll feel that way. If you have the peace that passes knowledge, if you know the love of Christ which passes not, wow, I can't talk. All right? If you know these things that pass knowledge, the peace of Christ, the love of Christ, you will feel bad for those that are fooled by this idea that this is a boring book. In this book we call the Bible are dramatic stories, real life stories that show us God's love, that help us to find our way out of destruction. There's people that you'll meet day after day. They're on a path to destruction. And this book can get them out of trouble. And it could get them into the arms of God. Now, as we pick up this story, we still see some folks that are oblivious to God. God is absent from their lives, but we see God in his providence preparing 2 folks in the midst of this royal plan. What was the royal plan, remember? So, the royal party, that was a problem. They had a problem there. And then, with the problem, it was Vashti. So, they told the king, hey, get rid of her. What was the royal plan that these men concocted for Ahasuerus? How are they going to fix this situation about Vashti being a rebellious wife? They're going to give him a new wife, right? That was the royal plan. We're going to get rid of her, and we're going to get you a new wife. So that's where we pick up. So God is preparing 2 folks in the midst of the royal plan that will almost single-handedly rescue their people from Satan himself. God takes 2 insignificant people that we did not know before, and through those two, he foils the plan of our arch enemy. 6,000 years of practice. One who is going to come and deceive the nations. You have the ability, through the providence of God, if you'll surrender your life, maybe not to do this, but to do something in your life for God. So, Satan himself had a plan for them. Remember that Israel is in exile right now. But that was not good enough for the adversary. He had a plan to bring them to the end of their road. Satan would like to kill every Jew if he can without them finding the knowledge of Jesus Christ. Satan, he would kill every one of them if he could. If you're a Jew here today, he wants you dead. He does not want you knowing who the Messiah is. But thank God, he had a providential plan behind this. So we will see three things today in this chapter. All right, so the thought of our chapter is providence preparing to. Here's point number one. The king ponders. The king ponders. Look at verse 1 of chapter 2. After these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus was appeased, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what was decreed against her. So this man his wrath is over. If you remember, after a 6-month-long party, he added another 7 days to celebrate with all the men, small and great. The first party for 6 months was celebrating with all of his leaders. Now he decides to be magnanimous, and he makes a new party for all the rest of the men, small and great. So he decided in this party to celebrate the riches of his kingdom and the honor of his majesty. But he also celebrated one of his possessions, his beautiful wife. Well, we know the story. She refused to come. And in his anger, he banished her forever. Now his wrath has been appeased. The word appeased means quieted, calmed, or pacified. And he begins to think about what he had done, the advice he listened to, and the advice he committed himself to. In the absence of God, under the influence of alcohol, in the heat of the moment, in anger, decisions can be very foolish. Most commentators think he regretted his decision, and I believe it's true. He had a beautiful queen he was proud of. He was so proud of her that he wanted to parade her around. One author said this: when the wine was gone out of the king and his anger cooled, he remembered his king and he remembered his queen and missed her. He had made a hasty decision when his mind was not clear. He was sorry, but it was too late. When he was under the influence of the wine, he was not thinking clearly. When he was afraid that his wife's actions would undermine his authority in the eyes of his people, he was not thinking clearly. But he could not go back. The law of the Medes and Persians forbid it. Once a law was made, it could not be altered. One author says, we all need to learn from this. There are times when no decision is the right decision to make. How many times have you decided to say something or do something, and then other times you decided to close your lips, and 24 hours later you felt, that was so much better that I didn't do what I thought I was going to do. Or if you did it, you regret it. Okay, so this author said, there are times when no decision is the right decision. So number one, Ahasuerus is pondering. The king is pondering what he did. So what happens? Look at verse 2. Then said the king's servants that ministered unto him. Well, we'll connect to that in a second. So number one, he was pondering his decision-making process. Probably wasn't very happy with what he did. But number two, his people see where he's at, and they know that there's a plan to get him a new wife, so they begin to work on the plan. Number two, the plan fleshed out. The plan fleshed out. So number one, the king's pondering. Number two, the plan is fleshed out. We see this in verses 2 through 4. Let's read in a minute. Well, I'll read there in a minute. Now, some timing, some chronological timing. It was the 3rd year of his reign when Vashti was kicked out. In this chapter, we see him in year number 7. Year number 7. So it's the 3rd year of his reign when Vashti was pushed out, but now we'll see it's the 7th year of his reign. Historians say he tried to conquer Greece, but he's home now in defeat, and he's missing his queen. So his servants decide to flesh out the royal plan. And in this plan, he actually falls prey to their plan for pleasure. What a foolish mistake this king made. But we'll see how it turns out. So his servants decide to flesh out his royal plan. The term flesh out simply means to provide more information about, to make more complete by adding details. So in chapter 1, we found out the plan was to get rid of Vashti, and we're going to get you somebody better. That's the plan. But now it's fleshed out. In verses 2 through 4, we're going to see how we're going to see how these godless people, in the absence of God, we're going to see the plan of how they flesh out the ability to get him a new wife. So their plan was to get him a new wife, but boy, did they think up something that was in the absence of God. Let's look at verses 2 through 4. Then said the king's servants that ministered unto him, let there be fair young virgins sought for the king. Do you think this appealed to a pagan king? Absolutely. It might be an enticement to a Mormon person, right? We have the Reorganized Church of Latter-day Saints. Matt sent me a cartoon video of the crazy things that Mormons believe. It was probably done in like the 70s. It looked like a 70s cartoon, talking about how they have all these spirit babies in heaven, and how you're going to get to have your own planet, you're going to get to become your own God, and you're going to have all these wives. That sounds like Satan's plan to me. All right? How do ladies feel? How do the Mormon ladies feel that they get to be sister wives? I don't think it's such a great idea. Jacob did. It didn't. God used it, but it wasn't too good for that family. They were definitely a dysfunctional family. But anyways, so here he's home, and he actually falls prey to their plan for pleasure. Let's look at their plan fleshed out. So it says, Then said the king's servants that ministered unto him, let there be fair young virgins sought for the king. I wonder, how old was this man? How old was this man? How old were these young ladies? And let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather together all the fair young virgins unto Shushan the palace. Remember, his kingdom went from Ethiopia all the way to India, almost 3,000 miles. So these men had a job to go find pretty young ladies that were virgins. This is their plan. And let the king appoint officers in all the provinces, 127 provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather together all the fair young virgins unto Shushan the palace, to the house of the women, unto the custody of Hege, the king's chamberlain. A chamberlain, again, was a man who ran apartments or ran like a hotel type thing. And Hege was the keeper of the women, and let their things for purification be given them, and let the maiden which pleaseth the king be queen instead of Vashti, and the thing pleased the king, and he did so. Now, was this a beauty contest that they all signed up for? Hey, I want to be the king's new wife. No, this was not. 127 provinces. All the beautiful young ladies that were virgins, they were rounded up and brought to the king. So this is a totally godless situation. This is a people and a system absent of God. Now, if you notice in the plan, he's still dependent on others. In chapter 1, he said to them, what should we do to the queen? And now he doesn't have his wife. He's pondering this whole situation, and they come up with another plan again. He's still dependent on others, but he's actually pleased with this idea. And then I think so much for his love for Vashti. When God is absent from our lives, we'll fall for a lot of things. I encourage you to keep your eyes and your heart and your mind in the Word of God, because guess what? If you don't, something else is going to take that place. I'm sure that every single one of you could admit that. If you don't spend enough time in God's Word, if you don't seek out the God of heaven, if you don't seek Him in prayer each day and seek Him in His Word each day, you're going to fall to your own ideas and your own ways. Doesn't mean you're going to be a horrible person in this world, but I promise you, later on in life, you went on a path like this. One person's walking this way to God, and you think you're walking this way to God, but later on in life, you find out you're miles from where you could have been. And then unfortunately, you have children on the path and friends on the path, and they've gone astray too. It's not going to necessarily be all your fault, but we do have an influence on people. I encourage you to keep your life connected to God. So remember, in the absence of God, you will fall for a lot of things that you wish you did not. The Bible says there's pleasure in sin for a season, and that's what this man was enjoying. But was this a treat for the young virgin girls from India to Ethiopia? No. Now, let's remember the two books written with ladies' names, the book of Ruth and the book of Esther. Now, the story of Ruth and Boaz was a story of love. They both fell in love. She gave up her old gods for the gods of Naomi. She said, where you go, I'm going to go. The God that you serve, I'm going to serve. The place you die, that's where I'm going to die. That was a beautiful story of love. This is not that story. This is a story of lust. Now, I'm not saying that God didn't work in those two people's lives. That's not for me to say. But God worked through Ruth and Boaz, but he worked a rescue through a depraved situation that was not based on love, but that was based on lust. You know, in my study yesterday, I hit a roadblock because, and it spun me for a while, because many of the commentators said Mordecai and Esther should not have been there. They should have gone on to Israel because they had the freedom to go. They chose to stay. And I struggled with that, and I thought, I have to be careful. I have to make sure I go by the scriptures. But good people were basically saying they were out of the will of God. So that, you know, as you can imagine in my study, it was like, wait a minute, I'm promoting these two, and then these authors are saying they were out of the will of God. So you must read your Bible, and you must make decisions for yourself. I tend to believe that they were right in the right place, and God used them, and God, wherever they were spiritually, he moved them to be right with God and to effectively help their nation. But it's good to be studying. It's good to consider these things that people say and go to the Bible for answers. So here's the situation. Now, as this king and his men are fleshing out a plan, watch this. God intercedes and takes over this plan. So this is a royal plan from godless people. Okay, they're fleshing out this plan. Hey, we're going to send you all over the nation. We want you to find all the beautiful young virgins, and we want you to bring them back, and we're going to give one of them to the king. God hijacks this plan. God, while they're fleshing it out, God finishes it off. Okay, God hijacks this plan, and he takes it unto himself. All right, so number one, the king's pondering. Number two, a plan is being fleshed out. Number three, a plan finished off. God takes over this plan and he moves it the way he wants. Remember the Bible in Proverbs, I believe, the king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. As the rivers of water, he turneth it whithersoever he will. And that's what God is doing for his people. We're going to see this in verses 5 through 23. Here God in his providence will supply power to his nation through two people. He'll take a wicked plan produced by godless people to deliver his own. While this plan has been put in motion, two people come to the forefront. Look at verse 5 and 6. Now in Shushan the palace, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem with a captivity which had been carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. Now this man was from the line of King Saul, Mordecai, who means taught of God. Now, if you want to go in depth to this story, this brings an amazing twist to it. One commentator said, if Saul would have finished off the Amalekites, the need for this deliverance would not have been necessary. Is anyone familiar with that? Yeah. Our arch enemy in this chapter is connected to an Amalekite. So if Saul had done his job, this may never have happened. Pardon me. So while they went from one end of the provinces to the other, from Ethiopia to India, looking for fair young virgins for the king, there was in Shushan the palace a certain Jew, a particular Jew God had already planned to use. So they're on this royal plan. They're going all through the nations, all through the provinces looking, and God has the answer right here in Shushan, right in the palace. All right? There was a certain Jew, a particular Jew, God had already planned to use. Coincidentally, just by chance, this man had raised a young lady. Let's see who she is. Look at verse 7. And he brought up, I love this name, Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother, and the maid was fair and beautiful, whom Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took for his own daughter. Now, they were looking for beautiful, fair young virgins. somehow God designed this young lady to be more beautiful than any that the king would find. You might say, that's cruel. Look what he put her in. No, God in his providence knew what Israel needed. Not only was she beautiful externally, we talked about this last week, favor is deceitful and beauty is vain, but a woman that feareth the Lord, she shall be praised. God had a beautiful woman inside and out, prepared for this situation. Now, again, we can look at this and say, this was not fair to do to her. This was not fair to do to all these other women. God didn't do this. God took this plan, overruled, and brought his daughter in to protect his people. I ask you this, is your life free to God to use, even if it's uncomfortable? Is your life given over to God, and he may allow you to go through something hard? Sometimes people in the ministry go through hard things. Look at what Paul went through. Does God own you enough to take your life and say, can I do this in your life and it'll bring good? Remember Hebrews chapter 11? People were sawn asunder. People were actually sawn. I heard it said this way. Some say that about Isaiah. He was sawn in half this way. We don't know, but the Bible does say that people were sawn asunder for their faith. Could God take your life to use for his great glory? In the book of Revelation, there's martyrs. And they're going to sing the song of the Lamb. And they're going to be praised like no other because they were willing to give their bodies for the Lord. So this is God's plan in this situation. So two people come to the forefront. Let's see her. We've seen verse 7. Her name was Hadassah. And Hadassah means myrtle tree. It means Esther, the same thing, or a star in Persian. Another said this myrtle tree bears a flower that looks like a star. God knew what he was doing. So Esther is this myrtle tree or this star. It just so happens that this maid was fair and beautiful. Again, was this by chance? No, this was not by chance. It just so happens that this maid was beautiful. It was Mordecai's cousin, and he took her for his own after the death of her parents. One commentator said it's possible her parents could have been killed when they were taken captive. We don't know. So, through these two, Providence begins to move. A.B. Simpson said, God is preparing his heroes. And when the opportunity comes, he can fit them into their places in a moment. Can you see that? God had these two. They weren't even known. In a moments of time, he was able to take Mordecai and he was able to take Esther and insert them into his story to save his people. So, A.B. Simpson says, when the opportunity comes, he can fit them into their places in a moment, and the world will wonder where they came from. Warren Wiersbe adds that God also prepares his heroines, for certainly Esther was divinely prepared. He says this, and this is a great statement. God is never surprised by circumstances or at a loss for prepared servants. If you will surrender your life to God, in any instant, God can use you in a moment of time to make a difference in his kingdom. I hope you're not like these people that are oblivious to God and they're godless. I hope that God can call upon you to do something in our times for him. And boy, do we need an Esther and a Mordecai in our times now. So God saw to it that Mordecai was provided to her as one who would love and parent her in the place of her mom and dad. Look at verses 8 and 9. Let me finish 7 just in case I didn't. And he brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, so this was his cousin, for she had neither father nor mother, and the maid was fair and beautiful, whom Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took for his own daughter. So it came to pass when the king's commandment and his decree was heard, and when many maidens were gathered together unto Shushan the palace, to the custody of Hegai, that Esther was brought also unto the king's house, to the custody of Hegai, keeper of the women. Now many of these men were eunuchs. They were castrated. And that was their job, to take care of this women, but they couldn't harm or take any of these maidens from the king. That's what they did to these men. But, verse 9, and the maiden pleased him, and she obtained kindness of him, and he speedily gave her things for purification with such things as belonged to her, and 7 maidens which were meet to be given her out of the king's house. And he preferred her and her maids unto the best place of the house of the women. So this is what's going on. So God put Esther in a spot where she would be where she would find kindness, where she would be preferred above the others and find the best place in the house of the women. Again, we could look at this and say this was not right of God to do this to her. But God reserves a right with his surrendered servants to affect this world. So let's see what he does to prepare her for her role. Did she know what God was doing? No, I don't see how she knew what God was doing. How did it feel to be a Jewish girl, to be possibly going to be married to a pagan king? I'm sure she didn't know what God was doing. What a situation she found herself in. Look at verse 10. Esther had not showed her people nor her kindred, for Mordecai had charged her that she should not show it. Many of the commentators I read said these weren't good Jews. They had not told what they were. They should have been known by the way they ate. They should have been known that they were Jews. My thought is this. Why was this? Was it a very anti-Semitic climate? It may have been a very anti-Semitic climate. If it wasn't, it surely became that way. And God gave Mordecai the discernment to know it and direct her. By the way, this young lady, we'll see, she followed the commandments of her father, her stepfather, if you would. So if it wasn't an anti-Semitic situation, it surely became that way. And God, through his wisdom, gave Mordecai the discernment to direct him to say, do not give away your people. So again, it's easy for a person 3,000 years later to say, I don't like what they did. They shouldn't have done this. Now, you weren't there. Okay? So look at verse 11. And verse 10 says, for Mordecai had charged her that she should not show it. Verse 11. And Mordecai walked every day before the court of the women's house to know how Esther did and what should become of her. Do you think he loved this girl? He absolutely loved this girl. All right? So, watch his care for her. Now, look at verses 12 through 14. What a life was ahead for these young ladies taken from their families. Now, when every maid's turn was come to go into King Ahasuerus, after that she had been 12 months, according to the manner of the women, for so were the days of their purifications accomplished, to wit, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with sweet odors, and with other things for the purifying of the women. These women, what a thing this was in the making of these women. They were probably making them work out. They were doing all sorts of things to beautify them for the king. Verse 13, thus came every maiden unto the king. Whatsoever she desired was given her to go with her out of the house of the women into the king's house. In the evening she went, and on the morrow she returned into the second house of the women, to the custody of Sheashgaz, the king's chamberlain, which kept the concubines. These women became concubines. They became subwives, a harem, basically, to this man. So don't compare this to Ruth, I don't think. Although God may have done something in their marriage together. We will see. But so in the evening she went, and the morrow she returned to Sheashgaz, the king's chamberlain, which kept the concubines. Watch this. She came in unto the king no more, except the king delighted in her, and that she were called by name. What a life that these women had. All as property to this godless heathen king. What a life was ahead for these young women. Think of these ladies taken from 3,000 miles from one end to the other, taken from their families, taken from their lives, that they may be part of the harem of a king. But though this was not easy for Esther, God was with her like he was with Joseph in exile. Remember, Joseph got sent to a place, and God had a purpose for him. Look at verse 15. Now when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her for his daughter, was come to go in unto the king, she required nothing but what Hegai, the king's chamberlain, and the keeper of the women appointed. Some of the commentators said she was so special she didn't need all of these other things. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all them that looked upon her. So God is undoubtedly moving in this situation for her people. So God had given her favor with those that looked upon her. Now look at verses 16 through 20. So Esther was taken unto King Ahasuerus into his house royal in the 10th month, which is the month Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. And the king loved Esther above all the women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown upon her head, and made her queen instead of Vashti. Now, I'd like to believe he fell in love with her, and we see that he respected her and did, but some of the commentators said he just loved her because she was the prettiest. I don't know the answer to that. All I know is this is a situation that God put her in, or allowed her to find herself in. All right, so verse 18. Then the king made a great feast unto all his princes and his servants, even Esther's feast. And he made a release to the provinces and gave gifts according to the state of the king. So he's happy again, and he goes back to his parties. Verse 19, and when the virgins were gathered together the second time, then Mordecai sat in the king's gate. So now God is moving in Mordecai's life, and he's moved him into the gate, into a position of some kind of authority. All right, so God is moving. She was outwardly beautiful. Her inward beauty was great. She was an obedient young lady to the only father she had. But now we see God prepare and protect Mordecai too. He was preparing both these two to be able to withstand the onslaught that was ahead. God is clearly moving in this godless situation. He's taking over the royal plan, and he's finishing it off with his touches. All right? The wisdom of power and power of God would not let this enemy overcome his precious sheep, Israel. It just so happened God puts Mordecai in a place where he was privy to some information. I love this because this builds to the next chapter. He puts Mordecai in a place where he's privy to some information that will turn out to be more vital than he could ever know. Look at verses 21 through 23. In those days, while Mordecai sat in the king's gate, two of the king's chamberlains, Bigthan and Teresh, of those which kept the door, were wroth, and sought to lay hand on the king Ahasuerus. And the thing was known to Mordecai, who told it unto Esther, the queen. And Esther certified the king thereof in Mordecai's name. And when inquisition was made of the matter, it was found out. Therefore they were both hanged on a tree, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles before the king. Do you see what God is doing? Those of you that know the story, you know what God is doing. God has put Mordecai in a position where he sees a plot, and he helps Ahasuerus' life to be saved. Esther's already in her place. Mordecai probably would not have been in that position without Esther. Okay? Probably there was some, once she got into position, hey, can you use this guy? I'm not saying that happened, but it probably happened. So now he's in place, she's in place. Two men try to kill the king, and you're going to see where this comes into play. It's a very vital part of our story. All right? As this story unfolds, those of us who know how it turns out, we can see God's love at work to rescue his people. We see the calculated hand of God preparing battle lines for the attack ahead. The players in the story don't know what's up. They don't know what's up ahead, but I bet you Mordecai and Esther have a sneaking suspicion, and we'll see it come in the next chapter. They have a sneaking suspicion that there's always a purpose that they were to live for. As we close, looking back at the past reveals the truth that God is always working. God works even when people are oblivious to him. God will work in ways that may surprise us. Don't put God in a box. He may do something that you don't expect him to do. That's not according to the way you think God should do something. God will work in ways that may surprise us. God is not limited by people in their ways. If you live for God, you may have the power to affect somebody else for God. Remember, there are lurking enemies of your soul today. And there's lurking enemies of Israel today. God is working his plan. When things look bleak, he's not silent. He is working. Now I ask you this in closing. Where will you find yourself in this plan? Are you part of God? Are you the subject of God's rescue? Or will you be the subject of God's wrath? You have a choice to fall under the plan of God like these two did, or fall under the plan of God for destruction. I hope you do the right thing. The choice is up to you.